Hello, everybody, all at once. This is Theo Cedar Jones on May 29th, 2019. And I kind of wanted to respond to Psyched Substance and other of the tripping reporters on YouTube who've talked about how they've come in some ways to the limits of their tripping on psychedelics and are contemplating stopping or taking breaks. And part of it is because of being traumatized by bad trips. And this prompts me to make a disquisition about tripping, and I thought I would call it Mushrooms and Nonviolence, because that is such a concise description of what made my early tripping days unique. I just spontaneously, around age 18 or 19, when I started tripping, I also made a vow of nonviolence, even though I had always had that. Really all my life, I knew that I was committing myself to an experiment where I would not own guns, I would not get into fights, I would not try to win through violence, and I would try to reduce harm. And that practice has been part of my activism. When I was 18, 19, 20, I did get arrested for protesting nuclear weapons and intervention in Central America. And nonviolent civil disobedience was part of my practice. And that was the context for my tripping. This was even before I learned how to play guitar, learned that I was going to be in a rock band. And this was before I had started the cooperative community. So there's a 4-year period of tripping before we moved into the cooperative household, and a 5-year period before we started having band rehearsals. And in that time, I had already found Adida, my guru. I had already affirmed nonviolence in my life. So I had these two very strong anchors. I also was always an artist. So even before I learned how to play an instrument, I was a graphic artist and knew I was an artist altogether in life. So having the self-identity of an artist, having a guru, Adida, and being committed to nonviolence and having clarity about harm reduction and vegetarianism and things like that just put me on a lighter spectrum of tripping karma, or if you like. Not that I didn't have horrifically bad trips. And in a sense, the description of these other guys about things getting darker, things just definitely got darker. And I also equate this with the period of time in my life when I was doing it, which was age 23, which was my Saturn return. So by the time I'd been tripping for 5 years, 18 to 23, it was getting darker. And that's partly the fact that when you go through Saturn return, you face all of your unfinished business in life, all your unresolved fear, all your unresolved childhood trauma, all your personal corruption, and all of your future work to resolve the ego that you haven't done yet. So your lack of maturity, all that horrible fear of like having to be an adult and taking on adult responsibility, I hit that when I was 23. I did it kind of earlier than most. And I didn't trip as much at that point. And I didn't even meditate as much. That's another thing. I had a meditation practice by the time I was 19 or 20. There was a daily meditation practice. I had the guru, I had meditation, I had nonviolence, harm reduction, vegetarianism, and I had been an artist. So I had all these kinds of supports that I'm not sure a lot of tripping people today have. That they have already figured out that they are an artist, that they've already figured out they're a devotee of Adida. they've already got a meditation practice, and they've already committed to nonviolence. See, I was already really in an unusually well-prepared position, or I just had all these gifts. I had all these opportunities and all this access to things I considered important. And then, so I'm saying I had all these good supports that helped make the fact that I could trip so much and for so long and so well. And by the time I left tripping, it wasn't because I'd had such bad trips I was traumatized by them. I'd had horrific trips, but they'd ended up being God trips. Like, all of the bad trips turned good during that one and same trip. And so I had a lot of confidence in a way that I could handle any bad trip and turn it around. But what I could not turn around, and the darkness that was like encroaching, was something I didn't finally really confront until my late 30s. And I was already disillusioned with all seeking, and I'd exhausted all my seeking. And I knew that psychedelics wouldn't make me happy, cannabis wasn't going to make me happy, marriage and romance, sex wasn't going to make me happy, music and rock and roll and being an artist, either famous or not, was not going to make me happy. And I'd exhausted every conditional option in life, because I'd had an unusually rich hippie existence where I could experience all these really exotic, erotic, esoteric pleasures and fulfillments, especially the creative ones. People say that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac, or that power is the ultimate addiction. But what they don't realize is how strong the drive is for creativity. For those who have that gift of originality and artistic ability, it's even more addictive to do something great in art than it is to necessarily be famous and powerful, but that goes right close behind. But you have to give credence to the power of the desire to be creative and to do something original and great as an artist, as a motivator. And that was my chief motivation, and even that wasn't going to fulfill me. So that's really exhausting, the possibilities of life, except kids. And then I had all these children who were my students, and that enabled me to exhaust that in a way. And I know that having children is not going to fulfill me and make me happy, or ultimately get rid of this one dogged problem, which is there is a darkness in my life that I cannot shake, and that my darker trips were pointing to, like, Theo, you've got to deal with this. And then the question becomes, well, what is it? What's making me have my come down when my trip ends, and what makes me have a bad trip? And it took me until after I'd had my experience of disillusionment where I realized that fear, worry, and guilt were my constant state, and I could not get rid of those nagging aspects of suffering. I could not. I'd exhausted every conditional recourse. I'd had very advanced spiritual teachers physically alive in my life, and I really applied myself to practice. And it wasn't until becoming Adida's devotee in 2001 that 70% of that suffering was just like gone within about 2 weeks. And that fear, worry, and guilt and social anxiety was immensely relieved, miraculously, divinely relieved. But there was still more work to be done, and it just points to the fact that if it looks like it's getting darker on psychedelics, well, you will not believe how dark it is. in the core of the onion of the ego self-contraction, which is what the dark trips are really about, is that you can't seem to control your fear sometimes, even as good of a tripper as you might have become. And that means gaining real experience, having real recoveries, having real skills as a tripper. That's a substantial achievement. And yet, it's not enough to be sure that you're not going to have the worst trip of your life. Really, right? And that trip could be so bad, so shattering, so shocking, so appallingly bad, and pointing to aspects of yourself that are naggingly impossible to get rid of or to deny at some point, that leaves you with permanent knowledge of parts of yourself that you can't get rid of and that are horrible. And so you've now got to deal with the fact that the ego in the human being, in you, is the chief culprit for all of your life's bewilderment, suffering, and bad actions, bad choices. And yes, your environment played a role in your suffering, of course, but it wasn't the originator of it. The origination of the darkest and worst of your trips, and that almost sense of there's a dark gravity pulling at one part of your mind, if you're susceptible, you let it spiral into that. There's various dark realms, of course, but there's something I found that was even deeper than fear or social anxiety or guilt or worry, which were like existential. They were just, couldn't get rid of them. Was a kind of irreducible, unlimited, and infinite sorrow. Sorrow was the color of the core of my ego, self-contraction. And there was terror. Concurrent with the sorrow was an absolute terror. And the infinite recognition that absolutely everything that you're attached to and every conceivable separation will take place, as Adida says. Every conceivable separation will take place. Everything that you can lose, you will lose. Everything that you are attached to will be ripped off. Everything that you could stand on as a shelf of security, protection, and consistency in conditional terms is subject to being washed away at any moment. Literally, boom, blasted away. So there's no security in conditional terms. I went to the guru. I went to Adida from like age 19 or 20. I had a recognition of him that was abiding. I knew I was never going to be confused about what the truth is or where God is or where I'm going to find the answer, because Adida has always been the answer. Adida has always been consistent. Adida has always been 7-stage divine self-realization, no ego. Perfect divine self-realization in the human form. So I'm very lucky. I'm tripping in the context of knowing who and what truth, God, and reality is with absolute certainty, and not based on religion, not based on belief, but an experiential, personal, tacit, direct experience of getting to spend physical time with him in his lifetime. All the kind of gifts you would want, a lot of them, of being with the God-man. That's the background of my tripping. That's a good background to have for your tripping. It's the best background to have for your tripping. And it answers that sucking darkness that's gripping at the edges of every trip. Every trip has anxiety. Every trip has a layer of fear, even if there's a breakthrough to ecstasy and even awakening, temporary awakening. There's still a come down, and there's still parts of the self that are so dark, especially having to do with sexual stuff, especially having to do with the core of the ego, which is probably going to be a unique experience for each person, but there's going to be something in it that has an infinite degree of fear, an infinite degree of sorrow, an infinite degree of terror, and that this is something you're doing You're generating this. You're a creator God who can create a whole theater of lifetimes upon lifetimes and of suffering. And if you've had a bad trip, you've in a way revisited like that sense of endless repetition of endless eons of suffering. And that's compacted into your tissues and your cell memory, and it's like that has to be dealt with. And that's being lifted. That's already gracefully, in a way. We're in a time of grace where the core of the ego has been destroyed in the universe. And Adida is now established as the truth. And we're never going to slip into the kind of darkness that we were in the past, but there's still a lot of unresolved stuff to deal with. But mostly it's your ego. Your ego is the last and final test of your ability to be enlightened and allow enlightenment, allow truth and reality as it is always already. And it is your destiny and it's your duty to be enlightened and to stop doing the ego self-contraction. But you can't just do that. You need graceful help from Adida, and you need to do the self-examination process where you inquire into the direct feeling of the self-contraction as it manifests moment to moment, without armoring, without deflection, without any other kind of consolation. And this is obviously the most difficult final practice that you'll ever get to. This is the worst, most hideous confrontation. It's worse than anything you could imagine. Okay? Your ego is the worst thing in your life. It is the thing it is the great Satan depriving you of your treasures, i.e. your faculties, the most. And no, you don't need an ego in this life. You don't need an ego to be strong, self-determined, sovereign, and in full possession of your faculties. So it's a lie to say, oh, you gotta have a healthy ego, you need an ego. No. You need your sovereignty and your faculties to be respected and cultivated, and you need to be equipped with the ego transcending wisdom, even from a young age, so that you'll know there is a way out of this dark sucking that's at the edge of your bad trips. That's always in the back of your mind, and every single fucking trip. Am I going to have a bad trip? Am I going to have the worst trip of my life? It's a potential every fucking time. And to really get to the heart of why there are bad trips and how never to have the bad trip of fear again, you've got to go all the way through the full ego transcending process with Adida and work with Santosha Matu. So you got a man, you got a woman realizer now, and you have this opportunity. If you're a tripper and you want to get to the core of why there are bad trips and why you have a come down and why there's a nagging fear of potentially the worst, ultimately bad trip, because now the word's getting around, psychedelic culture has reemerged and it's mature enough at this point that the word's getting back out like, oh yes, there's great potential for healing and self-understanding and creativity and every kind of fucking spiritual breakthrough on psychedelics. But there is a dark side to it, just like there's a dark side to the human personality, and you need the ego transcending wisdom to handle that, to get to the heart of it, to transcend it, and to be free of it. And obviously that is possible, and that's why I'm making this video, because you need more than mushrooms. You need the nonviolence part, and ultimately nonviolence means getting rid of the source of the violence, which you are doing to yourself and others by contracting. And this contraction is a violation of your status as radiant divinity. Why would you contract against it? Well, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune? No. Just because you're doing it. So, you can't not do it through sheer force of effort. You have to resort and abide with divine grace, with Adi-Da, and that'll do it. Just do what he says to do, to the best of your ability. Live in relationship with him. He'll take you beyond the ego and the source of bad trips.